Hello and welcome to Gav Chat, a talk show with Javina, myself, an Australian transplant to the United States, and the commentary for the January the 6th hearing today. Thank you for joining me. In the background, I have the Washington Post live stream that I've momentarily paused. They were talking about evidence that the January 6th committee might have been able to obtain with regards to Trump's fundraising off of his false claims, and they might do more to support an unveiling of the truth about Trump's knowledge that he had lost the election, his planning around his response to that knowledge that he'd lost the election but still wanted to claim he hadn't, so that he could unleash various armies, an army of lawyers prepared to subvert the Constitution, an army of paramilitary forces, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, who would mount an organized effort to overthrow the Capitol and overthrow government by disrupting the formal counting of the votes on January the 6th, as well as an informal army of people incited to violence by Trump's tweets and the false claims contained therein with regards to the stolen election, and how that's a physiologically arousing thing to do to people, to tell them that from a trusted source that they have been robbed blind, that their country is at risk of being overrun, and that the only way to take back the country is via strength. So thank you to anybody tuning in. I'll press play again on listening to the Washington Post respondent.
Nevertheless use them to raise money.
She's talking about Donald Trump raising money off the back of his bogus claims about election theft. And one interesting detail I'm going to interject here is that Donald Trump's campaign to solicit money, the Washington Post did an expose whereby they showed that the little yellow boxes that accompanied fundraising emails contained more and more text over time, more and more small print designed to bypass people's evaluative processes, and contained little ticks, pre-ticked boxes, making their donations reoccurring. So if they were reading the main body of the email, a solicitation and exhortation to donate to Trump, he needs you, this is his hour of need, he turns to you, his trusted supporter, and you make a $500 donation. Without knowing it, you've overlooked a little yellow box containing a lot of text about how, yes, it's so important to support Donald Trump, but a tiny little pre-ticked box with a tick in it that you've then, without consciously knowing it, agreed in a legal sense to continue to pay $500 on a monthly basis to Trump's campaign. So that took a lot of money out of the accounts of Trump supporters who unwittingly fleeced by Trump and his cohort of grifters and thieves. I think that is a really big point to argue that Trump is not only a sore loser, but a thief, someone who capitalized on people's yearnings to rob them and to gain access to robbing other people who weren't his supporters. So Trump fleeces his supporters directly, but he fleeced the United States Treasury whilst in office by repeatedly visiting his own properties and charging inflated rates, additionally high rates to the US taxpayer to house and feed not only Trump himself, but his retinue, the compulsory retinue of Secret Service officers assigned to protect the then President of the United States. All right, let's go back to the committee, see how they're going.
Feels like it is a thing that, feels pretty shady, if not outright fraudulent.
been showing their membership and the strength of their membership, and each person has been assigned and been working on specific aspects of this 7-part plan that Liz Cheney discussed last Thursday.
Oh, the 7-part plan. The committee has just divided up Donald Trump's actions into a 7-part plan to show the various stages of his efforts to overthrow the government and install himself as an unelected despot who violated the Constitution, who violated the trust of Americans, who violated expectations that the transfer of power would occur peacefully in the United States as a model democracy. And it's kind of the fruit of an under-acknowledged element of American democracy, that the vaunted Constitution itself still bears within it the legacy of America's economic might, early economic might, which was a function of its willingness to tolerate the slave economy and to profit from the slave economy and slave adjacent industries. Profiteering, slave profiteering, we'll call it, slavery profiteering. I want to always acknowledge the fact that these were human beings that were abused in furtherance of wealth, in furtherance of profiteering from the part of people who directly derived profits from not having a paid labor force, from owning a paid labor force, and indeed raping individuals within that unpaid labor force in order to compel the production and manufacture, a domestic supply of infants to further the profits, the levels of profiteering available in that slave trade, and that was the foundation of America's initial geopolitical standing in the world, and that not only were goods derived from cotton cheaper, but industries adjacent to that, such as clothing manufacturing, the overheads were kept down as a consequence of a non-paid labor force that were compelled against their will to pick cotton, to do other tasks, and to run America's agriculture, and in the course of doing so be deprived of their freedom and their liberty and their family integrity, because people were separated, children were sold away from their parents, husbands and wives were separated. There is a whole story, obviously, of human cruelty that had to be overlooked, that was part of the early status quo in America. And I've said that the Constitution contained within it pandering to those who had derived their wealth from that type of profiteering. So people who had not wanted to sign on to the Constitution, not wanted to sign on to the formation of the United States as it broke away from Great Britain, were encouraged to do so, were invited to do so through the capitulation contained in the Electoral College system, and through the way that population tallies were calculated through the 3/5 compromise. The people who owned slaves could do so in the knowledge that 3 out of every 5 slaves that they owned would be counted. I'll say enslaved people. 3 out of every 5 enslaved people would have their bodies counted towards a population tally, and that tallying process was used to determine a number of representatives to represent each state. So the political power of each state was swelled by the population of enslaved people. So the more slaves that were owned by wealthy people, the wealthy agricultural elite in any given state, the more political power that state could wield at the House of Representatives level. And a state with a small population still being appointed to senators regardless of voting population size also created an imbalance in favor of states with a relatively high non-voting slave population relative to a voting white population. Let's see if the hearing has started yet.
He is not a part of this, and we're only hearing a statement from his counsel.
Oh, that must be referring to Bill Stepien, whose wife went into labor today, reportedly, and he won't be appearing. He was a former campaign manager for Donald Trump. He took over after the scandals associated with, what was the other dude's name? Let's get a list of campaign managers, because I believe it was a dude who hit his wife and she called the police. She said she was concerned because he had guns on the property and was threatening to kill himself. So we'll have to find Pascal. No, it might have been Pascal. Trump campaign managers. So obviously initially was Paul Manafort, who Pascal. If I put in the word Pascal, we'll find it. Bill Pascal, Brad Pascal. He was hospitalized after a brief but tense standoff with police. Oh, and Fox News no longer has that article, perhaps. I'm getting a message saying something's gone wrong. So maybe they've taken that down. How comical of Fox. Okay, and MSNBC still has a link up that he was hospitalized after call of suicidal behavior, didn't comply with an officer's command prompting a rough arrest. Now it's saying 1 year ago. Surely it was more than 1 year ago, but all right. I want to read about it, not watch a video. Okay, so published on September the 28th, 2020. Yes, so it's that's shortly before the 2020 election. That's 1.5, close to 2 years ago. He was tackled to the ground by SWAT officers, Brad Pascal, when he didn't obey commands and was taken into custody under state guidelines, allowing for an involuntary mental illness commitment. His wife, Candace Pascal, called police on Sunday afternoon, saying that she and Trump's campaign manager had a verbal altercation. Let's watch that. There's a little bit of video footage here. Okay. Oh, we're gonna get to watch the police taking down one of Trump's former campaign managers. So thank you if you've tuned in. While we're waiting for the hearing to start, I'm going to be playing a little bit of footage shared by MSNBC of Brad Pascal. So it's a bit grainy. This is from September the 28th, 2020.
Frightening moments in Fort Lauderdale, captured on police body cam video and released just hours ago. Former Trump campaign chief Brad Parscale tackled by SWAT officers Sunday following a reported suicide attempt, according to police. A realtor showing a house nearby called 911.
I have a really nice lady who just came out, and she thinks her husband has shot himself inside her house.
On display in the 3-minute video, edited by Fort Lauderdale police, Parscale's wife Candace describing her husband's behavior as threatening to himself and others.
Came back out of his office, cocked his handgun, and went back inside.
According to the incident report, Candace told police after a verbal altercation, Bradley manipulated his slide to the rear, loading his firearm in front of her. Candace immediately fled residence and stated she heard a loud bang shortly after. Police say uncovered inside Parscale's home 10 firearms, including handguns, rifles, and shotguns legally owned.
You okay in there? Okay. All right. Can you do us a favor? Can you walk out with no weapons?
After contacting Parscale by phone, a standoff for hours, culminating in the tackle after police say Parscale ignored commands to get down. Tonight, the Trump administration tweeting, Brad Parscale is a member of our family and we all love him. We are ready to support him and his family in any way possible. Parscale now under care at a Broward County Medical Center under a state law aimed to help those considered a danger to themselves or others. Sam Brock, NBC News, Fort Lauderdale.
If you were...
Wow. And his wife did look so relieved when she could hear that the police had got into contact with her husband, that he was still alive and that he had not shot himself as she had initially feared. So I think it's important to sort of look at what the general options are of Trump supporters who buy into a lot of those shared belief and value systems, and they own weapons, and they, Trump endorsed political candidates do have a higher than statistically average likelihood of having assaulted their wives and domestic partners. Who's running for the Senate? Let's see, there's one person who's been accused of blackmailing, assaulting, and harassing a former partner who he tied up in his basement and took naked videos of against her will, and then threatened to use that if she ever disclosed the extramarital affair, the coercive extramarital affair happening between them. So let's find out which Trump-endorsed candidate, Republican candidate for Senate. Trump endorsed, was it governor endorsed candidate? There's Herschel Walker's a candidate for the Senate, Trump endorsed, who's admitted to holding a gun to his wife's head. Oh my gosh, yep, there's more than one Trump-endorsed domestic abuser. So the Nebraska governor candidate backed by Trump has been accused of sexual assault by 8 women, groping 8 women. That's Charles Herbster, so that's not who I'm thinking about. Is it Arkansas? No, this is a different candidate. Oh, a Republican candidate for Michigan governor. Ryan Kelly was arrested on Thursday for his involvement in the January 6 attacks on the Capitol. But no, that's not what I'm looking for. Maybe if I type in extramarital affair as well, that will help narrow it down. And maybe the hearing started yet. No. Kristi Noem, no. She's just denied having an affair. Greitens, okay. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but what's his first name? Phil? Let's have a look. Oh, Sean Parnell was running in Pennsylvania in the Republican primary, but withdrew because his wife was very clear in her statements that Parnell had physically abused both her and her children. Herschel Walker's been accused of pointing a pistol at her head and saying, "I'm going to blow your effing brains out." And Eric Greitens, okay, former governor Eric Greitens, Missouri, is now running for the Senate seat, vacated by a retiring Republican. And he resigned as governor in 2018 after admitting to an extramarital affair with his hairdresser. And a panel of state legislators had found that Greitens had coerced the woman into performing various acts and been physically abused, and warned that he'd post naked photos of her online if she didn't keep quiet. So that's Eric Greitens. Okay. So Eric Greitens, Herschel Walker, Charles Herbster, Sean Parnell are some of the various candidates endorsed by Donald Trump that have been plausibly, credibly accused by former partners of various forms of abuse.
Hunter was turned in, or
The hearings have started.
it was tipped off to the FBI by one of
Oh, no.
Hunter, the son's co-workers, who said that Hunter was bragging at work about being at the Capitol on January 6th. They're each facing 3 charges, and they have chosen to have a bench trial, which means that they have waived their constitutional right to a trial by jury, and a judge will decide whether they are guilty or innocent, and what sentence they get. And it's interesting because a bunch of January 6th defendants, it's a conversation about whether the jury pool in Washington, D.C., where these trials are taking place, some January 6th defendants are saying that they can't have a fair trial in Washington, D.C. So the bench trial is being run by Judge Trevor McFadden.
There's defendants that believe that they can't have a fair trial in Washington, D.C. are in a way illustrating a continuance of their belief that people of color who vote in the presidential election aren't legitimately voting. So they were perfectly comfortable with Trump seeking to overturn various state votes in the Electoral College system by discounting large swathes of urban electorate as illegal votes, even when there was no evidence and the claims were bogus. A lot of white men were comfortable with that because they believe, whether consciously or subconsciously, that the votes of Black people have less legitimacy than their own votes as white men. So, hearkening back to that constitutional era I was discussing, in which pandering and appeasement of white men, particularly propertied white men who profiteered off the central engine of America's economy at the time, which was slavery. Those men also don't think that a jury's verdict would be legitimate in Washington, D.C. because of, and I'm speculating here, but I presume they're trying to diminish the legitimacy of the jury because they understand there is a high proportion of Black people there who wouldn't pander to their white favoritism, who wouldn't say, oh, well, we'll find you not guilty because you clearly believed you were doing the right thing in attacking police officers and seeking to overthrow the name of the Capitol for the cause of supporting a white supremacist allied president. So have I said hello specifically, Christopher? Hello if I haven't. Nice to see you. I'll go back to turning on the live.
That's the trial. It starts today of the Seyfrieds. And Judge Trevor McFadden is a Trump appointee. Trevor
McFadden has actually come up with some fair decisions. So even though I'm suspicious of all Trump appointees, particularly those who appointed after Trump lost the election, when it became evident that, when it became even less plausibly deniable that the dude was a fascist who sought to overthrow the United States system of government and the system of democracy in the United States. Judges who accepted an appointment from someone who was so open in their rejection of the election results and so adamant in their promotion of a big lie meant to not only deceive the public, but to aggravate and incite a mob, whether it be a paramilitary mob or a supporting crew of befuddled members of the public with merely their bodies as weapons to use in a surge of people at the Capitol on that day, summoned by Trump, and his specific tweet will be wild, and his specific speech, you can't reclaim your country through weakness. All right, let's press play, see if the hearings have started.
Freddie, it doesn't just, it's not instantaneous. And so, yes, perhaps they'll play some of the Trump inner sanctum. We do know Harriet Hageman is his client. He's not just working for Liz Cheney's primary challenger in Wyoming. He's working for a bunch of other.
Oh, yeah. So Bill Stepien, the former Trump campaign manager, who was due to appear today at the hearings, but whose wife has reportedly gone into labor today. It was to be hoped that he would say something to reveal the criminality of his former boss. But an interesting detail I've only learned today is that he works currently for a Republican candidate who's challenging Liz Cheney. So, i.e., who's trying to undermine the value of Liz Cheney to the Republican Party as a potential anchor to reality. A lot of Republicans are prepared to follow Trump down his pathway of diverging from reality into a Trump fan fiction version of reality in which he didn't lose the election. He should be granted another term in office in deference to his stolen victory, and that it's fair and just to pervert the system of American elections by electing officials and governors who support and buy into the big lie and will therefore be more willing to defy the election and defy election outcomes and the actual specifications of the Constitution by writing in their own slate of electors, an alternate slate of electors, and sending that to Congress the next time there's a January the 6th date and the Electoral College votes are due to be counted. Oops, I've missed what Christopher's lolling at, but I'm glad to have told a joke. Something I played earlier, Christopher, was footage of the arrest of a different Trump campaign manager, Brad Pascale, who was arrested at his home after his wife ran out of the house in a bikini, and she didn't even have a phone with her. She was able to get a real estate agent showing a property nearby to call 911 on her behalf and say that there's this lovely lady who thinks that her husband has potentially shot himself because he had loaded a weapon in front of his wife, and as she fled the property, she heard a shot. So one presumes he fired into a wall or a ceiling, but he was not himself injured. There was a tense standoff for a few hours, and police managed to talk him out of the house. He emerged wearing shorts and no shirt and carrying a can of some type of beverage and no weapon. But because he didn't get on the ground when he was repeatedly asked to do so, they crash-tackled him to the ground, and he was then involuntarily committed to a hospital, to a mental health wing, under suspicion of being suicidal. And that was a dramatic end to the campaign manager career of Brad Pascale, who that was in September of 2020, so shortly before Donald Trump lost the presidential election. And that may have played a very minor factor in helping some people wake up to the fact that a lot of Trump supporters with access to guns are reckless with the safety of women in their social circle. I mean, that Brad Pascale intimidated his wife by loading a weapon in front of her. That's one way to scare the life out of your partner, is to begin to load a weapon and seem to have the intention of using that weapon against someone. And that they are often unstable, and that the whole paradigm of their existence, the whole white grievance, people are out to hurt me, so I have to have guns. The Second Amendment has legitimated my my desire to pretend that I'm part of a well-regulated militia as specified in the Second Amendment and as described in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So we'll have a little look. We'll first check to see if the hearing has started yet.
Very rare
No.
rare thing. And it does show that this is, in some ways, this committee is really the legislative branch reasserting itself against an executive branch that has become more and more powerful.
Well, yes, under Trump, definitely power was consolidated. The Congress was disempowered. And a Republican Congress didn't mind too much because a Republican-dominated Congress has the intention of obstructing most legislation. Uh-oh, I've accidentally closed some tabs, which means I have to reopen some of these tabs. And try and share this screen instead of the other screen. But I'm going to read out loud a little bit of the Constitution still. Article 1, Section 8. Okay, that's still add. Oh, they're coming in to sit down, so it's shortly going to begin. Okay. Christopher says Trump has a high disregard and disrespect for women. His support of guns is simply a ploy to get votes. I expect his supporters are the same. Well, just from my experience with talking to my neighbor who claims to need weapons in order to overthrow a tyrannical government, a claim which he says is sanctioned and validated by the Second Amendment. He thinks, I speculate that he thinks he needs guns for a race war, and that a lot of white people have guns for that purpose. They think they can use it preventatively to intimidate people out of starting a race war that in their fevered dreams they have imagined is always imminent unless they have weapons of mass destruction or weapons of war, such as an AR-15, which can be used to kill a large number of people very quickly. And that's part of their fever, that there's high levels of interdemographic hostility. And certainly there's a high level of interdemographic hostility in their hearts. So that projected hostility is part of their motivation, I believe, for continuing to misinterpret the Constitution.
Initial findings about the conspiracy overseen and directed by Donald Trump to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election.
Benny Thompson.
Block the transfer
Benny Thompson.
of power, a scheme unprecedented in American history. My colleagues and I don't want to spend time talking about ourselves during these hearings, but as someone who's run for office a few times, I can tell you at the end of a campaign, it all comes down to the numbers. The numbers tell you the winner and the loser. For the most part, the numbers don't lie. But if something doesn't add up with the numbers, you go to court to get resolution. And that's the end of the line. We accept those results. That's what it means to respect the rule of law. That's what it means to seek elective office in our democracy. Because those numbers aren't just numbers, they're votes. They're your votes. They are the will and the voice of the people. And the very least we should expect from any person seeking a position of public trust is the acceptance of the will of the people, win or lose. Donald Trump didn't. He didn't have the numbers, he went to court. He still didn't have the numbers, he lost. But he betrayed the trust of the American people. He ignored the will of the voters. He lied to his supporters and the country. and he tried to remain in office after the people had voted him out, and the courts upheld the will of the people. This morning, we'll tell the story of how Donald Trump lost an election and knew he lost an election, and as a result of his loss, decided to wage an attack on our democracy, an attack on the American people by trying to rob you of your voice in our democracy. And in doing so, lit the fuse that led to the horrific violence of January 6th, when a mob of his supporters stormed the Capitol sent by Donald Trump to stop the transfer of power. Today, my colleague from California, Ms. Lofgren, and our witnesses will detail the Select Committee's findings on these matters. But first, I will recognize our distinguished Vice Chair, Ms. Cheney of Wyoming, for any opening statement she'd care to offer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Last week, as the chairman noted, our committee began outlining a 7-part plan overseen by President Trump to overturn the 2020 election. Today, we will begin looking at the initial part of that plan. President Trump's effort to convince millions of Americans that the election was stolen from him by overwhelming fraud. A federal court has already reviewed elements of the committee's evidence on this point and said this, quote, "In the months following the election, numerous credible sources from the president's inner circle to agency leadership and statisticians informed President Trump and Dr. Eastman that there was no evidence of election fraud," close quote, sufficient to overturn the 2020 presidential election. The court's opinion methodically documents each of the principal reasons for that conclusion, and I would urge all those watching to read it. Today, we will begin to show the American people some of our evidence. Today, you will hear much more from former Attorney General Bill Barr's recorded testimony, and you will hear in greater detail what others in the department told President Trump, that his claims of election fraud were nonsense. You will also hear much more from President Trump's own campaign experts, who had also concluded that his fraud claims could not be supported. Let me focus briefly on just 3 points now. First, you will hear firsthand testimony that the president's campaign advisors urged him to await the counting of votes and not to declare victory on election night. The president understood even before the election that many more Biden voters had voted by mail because President Trump ignored the advice of his campaign experts and told his supporters only to vote in person. Donald Trump knew before the election that the counting of those mail-in ballots in several states would not begin until late in the day and would not be complete for multiple days. This was expected, reported, and widely known. You will also hear testimony that President Trump rejected the advice of his campaign experts on election night and instead followed the course recommended by an apparently inebriated Rudy Giuliani to just claim he won and insist that the vote counting stop, to falsely claim everything was fraudulent. He falsely told the American people that the election was not legitimate. In his words, quote, "a major fraud." Millions of Americans believed him. Second, pay attention to what Donald Trump and his legal team said repeatedly about Dominion voting machines. Far-flung conspiracies with a deceased Venezuelan communist allegedly pulling the
Chico
strings.
Chavez.
This was, quote, "complete nonsense," as Bill Barr said.
Bill Barr said bullshit.
President Trump's own campaign advisors, his Department of Justice, and his cybersecurity experts all told him the same thing. Here, for example, is White House lawyer Eric Hirschman. His view was shared by many of the Trump team whom we interviewed.
I thought the Dominion stuff was, I never saw any evidence whatsoever to sustain those allegations.
And third, as Mike Pence's staff started to get a sense for what Donald Trump had planned for January 6th, they called the campaign experts to give them a briefing on election fraud and all the other election claims. On January 2nd, the general counsel of the Trump campaign, Matthew Morgan, this is the campaign's chief lawyer, summarized what the campaign had concluded weeks earlier, that none of the arguments about fraud or anything else could actually change the outcome of the election.
Generally discussed on that topic was whether the fraud, maladministration, abuse, or irregularities, if aggregated and read most favorably to the campaign, would that be outcome determinative? And I think everyone's assessment in the room, at least amongst the staff, Mark Short, myself, and Greg Jacob, was that it was not sufficient to be outcome determinative.
As is obvious, this was before the attack on the Capitol. The Trump campaign legal team knew there was no legitimate argument, fraud, irregularities, or anything to overturn the election. And yet President Trump went ahead with his plans for January 6th anyway. Mr. Chairman, hundreds of our countrymen have faced criminal charges. Many are serving criminal sentences because they believed what Donald Trump said about the election, and they acted on it. They came to Washington, D.C. at his request. They marched on the Capitol at his request. And hundreds of them besieged and invaded the building at the heart of our constitutional republic. As one conservative editorial board put it recently, quote, "Mr. Trump betrayed his supporters by conning them on January 6th, and he is still doing it." Another conservative editorial board that has long supported President Trump said last week, Donald Trump, quote, "won't stop insisting that 2020 was stolen, even though he has offered no proof that that is true." And this, Donald Trump now, quote, "clings to more fantastical theories, such as Dinesh D'Souza's debunked 2,000 mules, even as recounts in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin confirm Trump lost. Those are the correct conclusions to draw from the evidence gathered by this committee. We have much more evidence to show the American people on this point than we can reasonably show in one hearing. But today, we will begin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In our opening hearing, we gave an overview of our investigation into the January 6th attack. The plot to overthrow the election was complex and had many parts, which we'll explore in remaining hearings. But today, we examine the false narrative that the 2020 election was, quote, stolen. Former President Trump's plan to overturn the election was lied and sustained efforts to deceive millions of Americans with knowingly false claims of election fraud. All elements of the plot relied on convincing his supporters about these false claims. Today, we'll demonstrate the 2020 election was not stolen. The American people elected President Joe Biden. We'll present evidence that Mr. Trump's claims of election fraud were false, that he and his closest advisors knew those claims were false, but they continued to peddle them anyway, right up until the moments before a mob of Trump supporters attacked the Capitol. We'll also show that the Trump campaign used these false claims of election fraud to raise hundreds of millions of dollars from supporters who were told their donations were for the legal fight in the courts. But the Trump campaign didn't use the money for that. The big lie was also a big ripoff.
Yes.
The former president laid the groundwork for these false claims well in advance of the election. As early as April 2020, Mr. Trump claimed that the only way he could lose an election would be as a result of fraud.
You know the things with bundling and all of the things that are happening with votes by mail, where thousands of votes are gathered, and I'm not going to say which party does it, but thousands of votes are gathered and they come in and they dump in a location, and then all of a sudden you lose elections that you think you're going to win.
The only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that.
It's the only way we're going to lose this election. This is going to be a fraud like you've never seen. Did you see what's going on? Take a look at West Virginia, mailmen selling the ballots. They're being sold. They're being dumped in rivers. This is a horrible thing for our country. This is not going to end well.
Mr. Trump decided even before the election that regardless of the facts and the truth, if he lost the election, he would claim it was rigged. Mr. Trump was right about one thing. It did not end well. On election night, Mr. Trump claimed even before the votes were counted that his loss was a result of fraud. Now, Thursday, we had testimony from Attorney General Barr about the Department of Justice investigation of Mr. Trump's fraud claims. Barr told Trump directly that his claims were BS. Yet, after hearing the truth and that warning from the AG, Mr. Trump continued to peddle the false claims of fraud.
Yeah, because he's a narcissist, and narcissists seek to generate their own reality through their own dictating what happened and what will happen. Very, very typical narcissist, deriving power and enjoyment from that wielding of power through trying to speak their truth into being, through co-opting as many people as possible into a grand scale deceit.
You'll hear detailed testimony from Attorney General Barr describing the various election fraud claims the Department of Justice investigated. He'll tell you how he told Mr. Trump repeatedly that there was no merit to those claims. Mr. Barr will tell us that Mr. Trump's election night claims of fraud were made without regard to the truth and before it was even possible to look for evidence of fraud. Attorney General Barr wasn't alone. You'll see.
It's a psychological process known as priming. When you prepare people for an outcome you're trying to orchestrate. So for a liar, you prime for the lie by telling people supportive lies, corroborative details that you are manufacturing, that you are selling to any susceptible audience.
And here today, other Department of Justice officials and senior advisors to Mr. Trump that they told him the claims he was making were not supported by evidence. The election fraud claims were false. Mr. Trump's closest advisors knew it. Mr. Trump knew it. That didn't stop him from pushing the false claims and urging his supporters to, quote, fight like hell, to, quote, take back their country. After he lost the election, various legal challenges were made. You'll hear testimony today from a renowned Republican election litigation lawyer who will explain the normal process by which candidates challenge an election. Rather than accept the results of the election and the decisions of the courts, Mr. Trump pursued a different strategy. He tried to convince the American people the election had been stolen. Many of his supporters believed him, and many still believe him today. The attack on January 6th was a direct and predictable result of Mr. Trump's decision to use false claims of election fraud to overturn the election and to cling to power. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
I now welcome our first witness.
Oh, first witness.
We're joined today by former Fox News politics editor Chris Stilwell. Bill Stepien, President Trump's former campaign manager, was subpoenaed to be here and was in Washington this morning, prepared to testify. Kevin Marino, Mr. Stepien's attorney, is here with us today. Thank you, Mr. Marino, for coming. And he has advised us that Mr. Stepien's wife went into labor this morning. Mr. Stepien
That's a good excuse.
unexpectedly had to travel to be with his wife, and we wish him the best. Due to the depth and rigor of our investigation, we've several hours of Mr. Stepien's testimony from when we interviewed him in February, and we will be presenting that testimony today. I'll now swear in our witness. The witness will please stand and raise his right hand.
I'm confused if this witness is from Fox or if this witness is the former
Swear or affirm on the
lawyer.
penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help you God.
Okay, the Fox News editor first.
Thank you. You may be seated.
And later the lawyer representing
Let
Mr.
the
Bill
record
Stephen.
reflect the witness answered in the affirmative. I now recognize myself for questions. I want to start by showing a video that tells the story of what was going on in the Trump White House on election night in November of 2020.
Video.
Do you remember where you were on the night of the election, November the 3rd?
This is going to be the man who called Arizona for Fox, which really disrupted Trump's fake narrative that he was on track to win the election and that anything that happened during the wee hours of the night would be evidence that it was stolen from him. So during waking hours, the pronouncement from the Fox political desk that Arizona...
You know where specifically over the course of that night you spent your time within the White House?
There was an event that was organized in the residence, so I moved between the residence, a room sort of off the residence where some family members were.
I take it the president was upstairs in the residence.
He was upstairs. We were kind of on the first floor, so not upstairs. We were with mostly with Ivanka and her brothers and a couple other people who'd be coming in and out.
Can you just describe the atmosphere? What were people expecting that night when you got to the White House?
I think that there was, typically for people who show up there on election night, it's going to be a self-select, more positive environment. And I think people were a little bit nervous, not knowing what was going to happen with the red wave or the red mirage as the debate was being carried out.
The Fox News Decision Desk is calling Arizona for Joe Biden. That is a big get for the Biden campaign.
Arizona's called.
Arizona, yeah.
I do. What do you remember happening where you were when Arizona was called?
There was surprise at the call.
Who was surprised?
Most everyone in the room.
Were you being one of them?
Yes.
Did that shift the atmosphere or the attitude in the White House?
Completely.
How so? Can you describe that?
Because Fox News was the first one to go out and say that.
They would have felt so
Was
betrayed.
anger kind of directed towards Fox News for making a call more so than like disappointment that maybe the campaign lost Arizona?
All the above.
So both anger and disappointment.
Both disappointed with Fox and concerned that maybe our data or our numbers weren't accurate.
Were you in the White House residence during the sort of past
Giuliani.
midnight into the early morning hours of November 4th?
Yes, oh sure. It went over beyond midnight, yes.
Do you remember Rudy Giuliani being at the White House on election night and into the early hours the next morning?
I do.
What do you remember about when he came?
Does everybody remember that Trump had a press conference at like 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 a.m., saying, I won. Like, let's just get out there with that narrative, even though it's a really weird hour of the night to hold a press conference, knowing that election counting was ongoing.
He was, I had heard that he was upstairs, in that aforementioned reception area. And he was looking to talk to the president. And it was suggested instead that he come talk to several of us down off the map room.
You said that you had heard that Mr. Giuliani wanted to talk to the president and then he was directed your way. Did you end up talking to Mr. Giuliani when he was directed your way?
I did.
What was that conversation?
A lot of conversations were directed my way. A few of us, myself, Jason Miller, Justin Clark, and Mark Meadows, gathered in a room off the map room to listen to whatever Rudy presumably wanted to say to the president.
Was there anyone in that conversation who, in your observation, had too much to drink?
Like Mayor Giuliani.
Tell me more about that. What was your observation about his potential intoxication during that discussion about what the president should say when he's addressed the nation on election night?
And the mayor was definitely intoxicated, but I do not know that his level of intoxication when he spoke with the president, for example.
Were you part of any discussions with the people I mentioned, Mr. Steffi and Mr. Meadows, or anyone else, about whether the president should make any sort of speech on election night?
I mean, I spoke to the president. They may have been present, but President spoke to the president several times that night.
There were suggestions by, I believe it was Mayor Giuliani, to go and declare victory and say that we won it outright.
It was far too early to be making any calls like that. Ballots were still being counted. Ballots were still going to be counted for days. And it was far too early to be making any proclamation like that.
I remember saying that, to the best of my memory, I was saying that we should not go and declare victory until we had a better sense of the numbers.
Okay, can you be more specific about that conversation, in particular what Mayor Giuliani said, your response, and then anybody else in the room's response?
I think effectively Mayor Giuliani was saying, we won it, they're stealing it from us, where'd all the votes come from? We need to go say that we won. And essentially that anyone who didn't agree with that position was being weak.
What was your view at the time as to what he should or shouldn't say?
I don't know that I had a firm view as to what he should say in that circumstance. The results were still being counted. It was becoming clear that the race would not be called on election night.
My belief, my recommendation was to say that votes were still being counted. It's too early to tell, too early to call the race, but you know, we proud of the race we ran, and we, you know, think we're in good position, and we'll have more to say about this, you know, the next day or the next day, whenever we had something to say.
And did anybody who was a part of that conversation disagree with your message?
Yes.
Who was that?
The president disagreed with that. I don't recall the particular words. He thought I was wrong. He told me so, and you know, that they were gonna, you know, go in a, you know, he was gonna go in a different direction.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
Mr. Steiwalt, did President Trump have any basis to declare victory on November 4th, 2020?
Turn the microphone.
Mr. Stepien also testified that President Trump had no basis for declaring victory at that point in time.
My belief, my recommendation was to say that votes were still being counted. It's too early to.
It was his big moment and he forgot to turn on his microphone, but somebody's pointed it out to him now, so hopefully he gets a second crack at it.
To tell, too early to call the race, but you know, We are proud of the race we ran, and we, think we're in good position, and we'll have more to say about this, the next day or the next day, whenever we had something to say.
Thank you. Mr. Stilwell, after the votes were counted, who won the presidential election of 2020?
Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. of the great state of Delaware.
Thank you. That's the bottom line. We've had an election. Mr. Trump lost, but he refused to accept the results of the democratic process. Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
They should re-ask the question where his answer was not heard because he failed to turn on his microphone.
Mr. Schierwald, I'd like you to explain a term that was thrown around a lot during the election, and that's the so-called red mirage. What does that mean?
So in the 40 or 50 years, let's say, that Americans have increasingly chosen to vote by mail or early or absentee, Democrats prefer that method of voting more than Republicans do. So basically, in every election...
Well, that tendency, I imagine, was heightened by COVID in the circumstances of 2020, because normally I think a lot of Republican voting retirees favor the mail-in vote. So I think it's a novel voting method preference to say that Democrats now predominantly prefer those methods. I think, although look, there are some people who want to avoid the congestion of predominantly Black communities where Republican governors have often sought to make that process antithetical to efficiency. They've sought to purposefully reduce the amount of resources devoted to allowing people to vote so it doesn't occur expeditiously, so that people have to wait in queues. That is designed to reduce the number of people who are able to participate in America's democratic process. It's designed to deter Black voters from voting, to reduce the number of Black Americans exercising any degree of political power within the American system.
Republicans win election day and Democrats win the early vote. And then you wait and start counting. And it depends on which ones you count first, but usually it's election day votes that get counted first. And you see the Republicans shoot ahead. And then the process of bailing and binding and unbinding all those mail-in votes. And some states like Pennsylvania refuse to.
Yeah, exactly. You can choose to count the mail-in votes first that have already come in. And many Republican state legislatures voted specifically to count mail-in votes second, with presumably the intention of contributing to that red mirage effect of bolstering Trump's claims to have won the election based on not early vote counting, in-person, COVID-relaxed voting, and to push back the counting of the early vote, to push back the counting of mail-in votes that had already come in so that they were counted second, so that it would contribute to a narrative that would serve Trump, that the counting of votes after the election day in-person votes would illustrate that Biden had stolen the election, that there was a conspiracy to rob Trump of his rightful victory.
Count the votes first, so you have to wait for all of that to come in. So in every election, and certainly a national election, you expect to see the Republican with a lead, but it's not really a lead. When you put together a jigsaw puzzle, it doesn't matter which piece you put in first. It ends up with the same image. So for us,
good analogy.
Who cares? But that's because no candidate had ever tried to avail themselves of this quirk in the election counting system. We had gone to pains, and I'm proud of the pains we went to make sure that we were informing viewers that this was going to happen, because the Trump campaign and the president had made it clear that they were going to try to exploit this anomaly. And we knew it was going to be bigger because the percentage of early votes was higher, right? We went from about 45% of the votes being early and absentee. Because of the pandemic, that increased by about 50%. So we knew it would be longer. We knew it would be more. So we wanted to keep telling viewers, hey, look, the number that you see here is sort of irrelevant because it's only a small percentage of these votes.
So this red mirage, that's really what you expected to happen on election night.
Happens every time.
Thank you,
Every time.
Mr. Stirewalt.
Okay.
Now, I'd like to play a clip of Attorney General Bill Barr, who also explains what was expected to happen on election night.
Right out of the box on election night, the president claimed that there was major fraud underway. I mean, this happened, as far as I could tell, before there was actually any potential of looking at evidence. And it seemed to be based on the dynamic that at the end of the evening, a lot of Democratic votes came in, which changed the vote counts in certain states. And that seemed to be the basis for this broad claim that there was major fraud. And I didn't think much of that because people had been talking for weeks and everyone understood for weeks that that was going to be what happened on election night.
Mr. Stepien obviously could not be with us today, and it's proper for him to be with his wife as they welcome their child. But he also had discussions with the president about the red mirage. That is, that it would be a long night and that early votes would favor him, but lots more votes would be counted over the course of the night and the days after. So let's play clip 1 from our interview with Mr. Stepien.
I recounted back to that conversation with him, in which I said, just like I said in 2016 was going to be a long night. I told him in 2020 that it was going to be a process again, as the early returns are going to be positive, and we're going to be watching the returns of ballots as they rolled in thereafter.
So is it fair to say you're trying to present what you thought would be a realistic picture of what might happen over the course of that night, being election night?
That night and the days that follow. Yeah, I always told the president the truth, and I think he expected that from me, and I told him it was going to be a process. It was going to be, we're going to have to wait and see how this turned out. So I just like I did in 2016, I did the same thing in 2020.
So let's watch a short clip of President Trump speaking after he received that information from his campaign advisors.
We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list.
We want all voting to stop.
President Trump said that, it contradicted what his advisors had warned would happen. We all know that mail-in ballots played an important role in the 2020 election. However, President Trump continuously discouraged mail-in voting. Mr. Stepien was so concerned about the president's position on mail-in voting that in the summer of 2020, he met with President Trump along with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. Let's play clip 4.
Meeting that was had, in particular, I invited Kevin McCarthy to join the meeting, he being of like mind on the issue with me, in which we made our case for why we believed mail-in voting not to be a bad thing for his campaign. But the president's mind was made up, and you understand, how many times to, go to the well on a particular topic.
Yeah, I understand. Tell me a little bit more about the argument that you and Mr. McCarthy made to the president in that meeting as to why it wasn't a bad thing that mail-in voting was available.
Largely two pillars to that argument, both of which I've previously mentioned. One, leaving a good deal to chance, pushing or urging your voters to vote only on election day leaves a lot to chance. That's A. And B, also previously mentioned, the fact that the Trump campaign, Republican National Committee, Republican Party had an advantage of grassroots workers and volunteers on the ground.
Yes, grassroots workers who weren't afraid to knock doors during a pandemic, because Democratic volunteers were more likely to not want to disturb people in their homes during a pandemic. Trump had cultivated his supporters and people who trusted the truth coming from his, as he spoke it, didn't believe that COVID was a real pandemic, believed that it was overplayed, believed that it was a product of media hype, and they believed it was a product of left-leaning media hype and the Democratic Party's propaganda. So I don't think this committee hearing will go into it, but I do believe that Trump had a conspiracy with his appointed Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, who's still in his position as Postmaster General of the United States, to sabotage the delivery of mail-in votes. So Bill Stepien might not have been conscious of that conspiracy or part of it, but I don't entirely trust him when he says, yes, he urged Trump to embrace mail-in votes and embrace the fact that, yes, a lot of Republican elderly white people do typically avail themselves of easy voting methods, such as mail-in voting. And it was to alienate some of those, well, not alienate, but to discourage the more immobile Republican voters from voting if they were too frail to vote in person, if they and to then discourage them from participating in the voting by mail process, because he was making it tantamount to sabotage, to say that mail-in voting was going to be such a corrupt process, with the implication being that if you voted by mail, your vote would be stolen and changed to a vote for Joe Biden.
That would allow, an advantage to enhance return rates of ballots that were mailed. Those were the two pillars of the argument.
I see. And what, if anything, do you recall Representative McCarthy saying during that meeting?
We were echoing the same argument. I mean, his words echoed mine, and vice versa on those two topics.
Mr. Stirewalt, you were at the decision desk at Fox News on election night, and you called Arizona early for President Biden, which was controversial. How did you make that call, and where did you think the race stood in the early hours of the next day?
Well, it was really controversial to our competitors who we beat so badly by making the correct call first. Our decision desk was the best in the business, and I was very proud to be a part of it. Because we had partnered with the Associated Press and the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, thanks to my colleague and friend Arnon Mishkin, had built a wonderful device for forecasting the outcomes of elections. So we had a different set of data than our competitors did. We had more research, and we had a better system, and we had a great team. So what you're waiting to see is, do the actual votes match up with the expectations in the poll? The real votes are testing the quality of your poll in targeted precincts and in targeted places. And let me tell you, our poll in Arizona was beautiful, and it was doing just what we wanted it to do, and it was cooking up just right. And at some point, and I forget exactly who, but at some point it became clear that Arizona was getting ready to make a call. So my boss, Bill Salmon, said, we're not making any call until everybody says yes, because that was always our policy, unanimity. And you have to understand, in this room, you have, the best people from academia, Democrats, Republicans, a broad cross-section of people who had worked together for a decade, who are really serious about this stuff. So we knew it would be a consequential call because it was one of 5 states that really mattered, right? Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona were the ones that we were watching. We knew it would be significant to call any one of those.
I'm just taking a quick break to remind people why, in part, Arizona rejected Trump at a collective level. And that would be because Senator John McCain was a beloved figure in Arizona politics. Trump repeatedly besmirched the man before winning in 2016 and on a continuing basis during his time in office. So Arizona was a consequential part of white backlash, a necessary, critical degree of white people recognizing that their loyalty, that their attraction to Donald Trump as the epitome of the American dream and America's last hope for sustaining white political dominance, that it was a mirage, and that Trump was a white supremacist who would not serve white people, who would disparage a war hero, who was not aligned with any good values.
It's 5, but we already knew Trump's chances were very small and getting smaller based on what we had seen. So we were able to make the call early. We were able to beat the competition. We looked around the room. Everybody says yay, and on we go. And by the time we found out how much everybody was freaking out and losing their minds over this call, we were already trying to call the next state. We had already moved on. We were to Georgia. We were to North Carolina. We were looking at these other states. So we thought we were pleased, but not surprised.
I see. You know, after the election, as of November 7th, in your judgment, what were the chances of President Trump winning the election?
After that point?
Yes.
None. I mean, I guess it's always possible that you could have, a truckload of ballots be found somewhere, I suppose. But once you get into this space, ahead of today, I thought about what are the largest margins that could ever be overturned by a recount, and the kind of stuff that we heard Mike Pence talking about, sounding like a normal Republican that night when he said, we'll keep every challenge. Nothing like that. In a recount, you're talking about hundreds of votes. When we think about calling a race, one of the things that we would think about is it outside the margin of a recount? And when we think about that margin, we think about, in modern history, you're talking about 1,000 votes, 1,500 votes at the way, way outside. Normally, you're talking about hundreds of votes, maybe 300 votes that are going to change. So the idea that through any normal process in any of these states, remember, he had to do it thrice, right? He needed 3 of these states to change. And in order to do that, I mean, you're at an infant. You're better off to play the Powerball than to have that come in.
On November 7th, the other major news outlets called the race for President Biden. Now, Mr. Stepien told the committee that he thought the odds were, and this is a quote, very, very, very bleak, and held a meeting with the president that same day. Let's show clip 8, video clip 8.
I mean, with each day that wore on, I mean, the trajectory of the race on election night, Trump ahead in many states. And as that week wore on, as the 3rd became the 4th, became the 5th, and so on and so forth, and the vote by mail ballots were tabulated, Trump's lead, grew more narrow, and in some places, Biden surpassed, Trump in the vote totals. So as the week wore on, as we paid attention to those numbers multiple times a day, internally, I was feeling less confident for sure.
What was your view on the state of the election at that point?
Very, very, very bleak.
The screenshot.
The group that went over there outlined, my belief in chances for success at this point, and then we pegged it at 5, maybe 10% based on recounts that either were automatically initiated or could be initiated based on realistic legal challenges, not all the legal challenges that eventually were pursued. But, you know, it was, you know, my belief is that it was a very, I mean, 5 to 10%. It's not a very good, optimistic outlook.
Now, as President Trump and others continued to claim that the election was stolen, there were lawyers who were a part of the campaign lawyers, who were responsible for investigating the fraud claims. That includes Alex Cannon, who could not validate the claims that were being made, including those being made by the president. Let's roll video 15. 13.
This is an email. It's 2 emails, actually. The first is from Alex Cannon to you and Faith McPherson. And then you forward that email on to Mark Meadows, Justin Clark, and Jason Miller, the subject being AZ Federal ID voters. If you look at the original email there, it says, Bill, we completed the AZ analysis you requested. I assume that's about Arizona. And because of the substantial uncertainty surrounding the databases, this is a highly unreliable way to identify ineligible voters. Can you explain the task that you gave to Ms. Cannon for this Arizona analysis?
Sure. Previously, I described some of my frustration with some of the claims that people would throw at President Trump regarding, you need to look at this, this happened in this state or that happened in that state. And it would be, those would flow to us to look into. I talked about that before, I think.
Yeah.
This is an example of that. I recall in Arizona, someone had thrown out, I believe this to be the claim, that there were thousands of illegal citizens, people not eligible to vote, having cast their ballots in Arizona. Someone had thrown out that claim to President Trump. And with, the margins being as close as they were, as I previously described, that could potentially matter. So this wild claim is thrown out, which, on its face didn't seem, realistic or possible to me. I asked Alex to look at the claim, and I haven't read this full email, but I recall the response to that. The reality of that was not illegal citizens voting in the election. I think it was like overseas voters voting in the election. So obviously, people who were eligible to vote.
When these findings were passed up the chain to President Trump, he became frustrated and he replaced the campaign's legal team. Let's play clip 14.
I think the president, it was during the second week where things like you displayed were occurring, where he was growing increasingly unhappy with his team, me, less so because I was less involved at this point, but still me, growing increasingly unhappy with Justin Clark. And that kind of, paved the way for, Justin to be moved out and Mayor Giuliani to be moved in as person in charge of, the legal side of the campaign, and for all intents and purposes, the campaign.
Now, when Mr. Stepien became campaign manager, he was the second Trump campaign manager for the 2020 race, and there were only about 115 days until Election Day. So let's play the video.
I inherited a campaign that was, the day I was hired was President Trump's low point in the 2020 daily average polling against President Biden. It was a campaign at a low point in the polls. It was structurally and fiscally deficient. There was a great deal wrong with the campaign in both of those areas. So most of my day spent fixing and I think I took over with 115 days left in the campaign. Most of my time was spent fixing the things that could be fixed with 115 days left in the campaign.
Now, Mr. Stepien has been in the campaign field for a long time, and he worked for lots of different candidates and campaigns. He testified to this committee about his concerns given the claims that Mr. Giuliani and Ms. Powell and their team were making publicly. Let's play clip 15.
Okay, and was it important for you, Mr. Stepien, to sort of pull back just for your own professional reputation? You didn't want to be associated with some of what you were hearing from the Giuliani team and others that sort of stepped in the wake of your departure?
I didn't mind being categorized. There were two groups of, we called them kind of my team and Rudy's team. I didn't mind being characterized as being part of Team Normal, as reporters, kind of started to do around that point in time. I said, hours ago, early on that, I've been doing this for a long time, 25 years, and I've spanned, political ideologies from Trump to McCain to Bush to Christie, and, I can work under a lot of circumstances for a lot of varied, candidates and politicians, but situation where, and I think along the way I've built up a pretty good, I hope, a good reputation for being honest and professional, and I didn't think what was happening was necessarily honest or professional at that point in time. So that led to me stepping away.
So the president did get rid of Team Normal, and I'd like to play a clip showing that the president found the people he needed to perpetuate his claims of fraud.
They saw a big truck bringing in 100,000 ballots in garbage cans, in waste paper baskets, in cardboard boxes, and in shopping baskets. And every single one of them was for Biden because they were being notified by Smartmatic in Frankfurt that Biden was way behind and they better come up with a lot more ballots. And we can prove every single thing I just said. If you gave me the paper ballots, I could probably turn around each one of these states. I'm absolutely convinced if you let me examine each one of those ballots, I'd pull out enough that were fraudulent that it would shake the hell out of the country.
It can set and run an algorithm that probably ran all over the country to take a certain percentage of votes from President Trump and flip them to President Biden, which we might never have uncovered had the votes for President Trump not been so overwhelming in so many of these states that it broke the algorithm.
I remember that one of the things Mark said at some point was, you can't show an actual vote was flipped, which I found at the time to be a remarkable assertion because you don't have to have the gun to see the body lying on the floor bleeding out with 5 bullet holes in it was killed by a gun.
What they were proposing, I thought was nuts. And the theory was also completely nuts, right? I mean, it was a combination of Italians, the Germans. I mean, different things have been floating around as to who was involved. Remember, Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelan, she has an affidavit from somebody who says they wrote a software in, it's something with the Philippines, just all over the radar.
Did you ever share, Mr. Kushner, your view of Mr. Giuliani? Did you ever share your perspective about him with the president?
I guess, yes.
Tell me what you said.
Basically, not the approach I would take if I was you.
Okay, and how did he react? How did President Trump react when you shared that view with him?
We said,
I have confidence in Rudy.
I think I had conversations with probably all of our council who are signed up to assist on election day as they disengaged with the campaign. The general consensus was that law firms were not comfortable making the arguments that Rudy Giuliani was making publicly. I seem to recall that I had a similar conversation with most all of them.
I made it clear I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bullshit. And, I didn't want to be a part of it. And that's one of the reasons that went into me deciding to leave when I did.
Even Sidney Powell, defending herself in a defamation lawsuit brought by Dominion Voting Systems, argued that, quote, no reasonable person would conclude that her statements were truly statements of fact. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the witness for joining us today. The first panel is now dismissed.
Thank you, first panel, for your service. I would love to have had more information about what Donald Trump tried to do in savaging the
Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren.
mail-in vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week, we presented the testimony of former Attorney General Bill Barr, who testified before this committee. Today, we present additional evidence, including his testimony that former President Trump started making claims of election fraud immediately after the election, and that Barr concluded the claims were untrue. Now, due to the length of Attorney General Barr's testimony, we're only going to include relevant portions at the hearing today. So let's play the video.
The department, in fact, when we received specific and credible allegations of fraud, made an effort to look into these to satisfy ourselves that they were without merit. And I was in the posture of trying to figure out, there was an avalanche of all these allegations of fraud that built up over a number of days, and it was like playing whack-a-mole because something would come out one day and then the next day it would be another issue. Also, I was influenced by the fact that all the early claims that I understood were completely bogus and silly and usually based on complete misinformation. And so I didn't consider the quality of claims right out of the box to give me any, feeling that there was really substance here.
For the first time since the election, the Attorney General spoke personally with the President on November 23rd, and this was at the White House. Let's play the video, please.
So on November 23rd, I hadn't spoken to the president since the election, and in fact, as I said, since the middle of October, roughly. And it was a little getting awkward because obviously he had lost the election and I hadn't said anything to him. And so Cipollone said, I think it's time you come over here. And so I came over to meet with the president in the Oval Office, and Meadows and Cipollone were there. And the president, and this is leading up to this conversation with Kushner, the president said there had been major fraud and that as soon as the facts were out, the results of the election would be reversed. And he went on this for quite a while, as he's prone to do. And then he got to something that I was expecting, which is to say that apparently the Department of Justice doesn't think that it has a role of looking into these fraud claims. So I said, that has to be the campaign that raises that with the state. The department doesn't take side in elections, and the department is not an extension of your legal team. And our role is to investigate fraud, and we'll look at something if it's specific, credible, and could have affected the outcome of the election, and we're doing that, and it's just not. They're just not meritorious. They're not panning out. And as I walked out of the Oval Office, Jared was there with Dan Scavino, who ran the president's social media, and who I thought was a reasonable guy and believe is a reasonable guy. And I said, how long is he going to carry on with this stolen election stuff? Where's this going to go? And by that time, Meadows had caught up with me and leaving the office, and he caught up with me and said that he said, look, I think that he's becoming more realistic and knows that there's a limit to how far he can take this. And we're working on this. We're working on it.
No, he's not limited by thinking that he can. There's no point hoping that Trump will become more realistic. He's a fascist who, like a shark, has to keep swimming forwards to stay afloat in the water. He has to keep escalating his claims. He has to keep building lies on top of lies because that sustains him. If you give his supporters enough peace and quiet to engage with reality, they could come to their senses. You have to keep fueling the manufactured outrage. You have to keep feeding them lies that things were stolen from them, that the election was stolen despite the paucity of evidence, despite the apparent bogusness of the claims. You have to keep lying to them to never give them enough quiet time to reflect that they've been had by a thief, conman, grifter. You have to continue to extract more money.
Even after his attorney general told him his claims of election fraud were false, President Trump continued to promote these claims.
I felt that things continued to deteriorate between the 23rd and the weekend of the 29th. And then on November 29th, he appeared on Maria Bartiromo's show, Sunday Futures, I believe it was. And he said that the department was missing in action.
Well, no, we had glitches where they moved thousands of votes from my account to Biden's account. And these are glitches. So they're not glitches, they're theft. They're fraud, absolute fraud. This election was over. And then they did dumps. They call them dumps, big, massive dumps in Michigan and Pennsylvania and all over. How the FBI and Department of Justice, I don't know, maybe they're involved, but how people are allowed to get away from this with this stuff is unbelievable.
Now, spurred by what he saw, Barr told the Associated Press on December 1st that there was no evidence of election fraud. And immediately after Attorney General Barr's statement went public, Mr. Trump berated and he nearly fired Barr. But Barr persisted in telling the president that there was no evidence to support the fraud claims.
This got under my skin, but I also felt it was time for me to say something. So I set up a lunch with the AP reporter, Mike Balsamo, and I told him at lunch, I made this statement that to date we have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election. I had a later meeting scheduled at the White House at 3 o'clock with Meadows. This was previously scheduled, so I knew this was going to come up, and I went over there and I told my secretary that I thought I would probably be fired and told not to go home. I mean, not to go back to my office. So I said, you might have to pack up for me. And so when I got over there, I met with the chief of staff. He said the president was angry. He didn't really get into the issue of the fraud. And then I went up to Pat Cipollone's office and we were talking with each other. And the word came down that he wanted us both to go to the Oval. And the president was as mad as I've ever seen him, and he was trying to control himself. And the president said, well, this is killing me. You didn't have to say this. You must have said this because you hate Trump. You hate Trump. And then he raised the big vote dump, as he called it, in Detroit. And that, he said people saw boxes coming into the counting station at all hours of the morning and so forth. And I explained to him that at that point, I knew the exact number of precincts in Detroit. I think it was 630 something. I said, Mr. President, there are 630 precincts in Detroit, and unlike elsewhere in the state, they centralized the counting process, so they're not counted in each precinct. They're moved to counting stations, and so the normal process would involve boxes coming in at all different hours. So there's nothing. And I said, did anyone point out to you, did all the people complaining about it point out to you, you actually did better in Detroit than you did last time? I mean, there's no indication of fraud in Detroit. And I told him that the stuff that his people were shoveling out to the public was bullshit. I mean, that the claims of fraud were bullshit. And
So he loves the word
he was
bullshit.
indignant about that. And I reiterated that they'd wasted a whole month on these claims on the Dominion voting machines, and they were idiotic claims. And I specifically raised the Dominion voting machines, which I
Yes, because Hugo Chavez is dead and has been for a while. I like it when the media don't just say there is lack of evidence to support Trump's claims. Trump's claims and Sidney Powell's claims were bold-faced lies with no credibility.
found to be among the most disturbing allegations, disturbing in the sense that I saw absolutely zero basis for the allegations, but they were made in such a sensational way that they obviously were influencing a lot of people, members of the public, that there was this systemic corruption in the system and that their votes didn't count and that these machines controlled by somebody else were actually determining it, which was complete nonsense. And it was being laid out there. And I told them that it was crazy stuff and they were wasting their time on that. And it was doing a grave disservice to the country.
Yes, grave disservice to the country.
So the very next day, the president released a video rehashing some of the very same claims that his chief law enforcement officer had told him were, quote, nonsense.
Here's an example. This is Michigan. At 6:31 in the morning, a vote dump of 149,772.
He loves the word dump because he's trying to make an association between counting of votes for Biden and horse manure. Bullshit. He's trying to in furtherance of his false claims, he is relishing the word dump and putting particular emphasis on it.
Votes came in unexpectedly.
Unexpectedly, no votes get counted. No, you weren't winning by a lot. It's a red mirage. Anyway.
Was received in horror.
In
We have
horror.
a company that's very suspect. Its name is Dominion. With the turn of a dial or the change of a chip, you can press a button for Trump and the vote goes to Biden. What kind of a system is this?
Barr again told the president that there was nothing to these claims on December 14th.
When I walked in, sat down, he went off on a monologue saying that there was now definitive evidence involving fraud through the Dominion machines. And a report had been prepared by a very reputable cybersecurity firm, which he identified as Allied Security Operations Group, and he held up the report. And then he asked that a copy of it be made for me. And while a copy was being made, he said, this is absolute proof that the Dominion machines were rigged. The report means that I'm going to have a second term. And then he gave me a copy of the report. And as he talked more and more about it, I sat there flipping through the report and looking through it. And to be frank, it looked very amateurish to me. Didn't have the credentials of the people involved, but I didn't see any real qualifications. And the statements were made very conclusory, like, these machines were designed to, engage in fraud or something to that effect, but I didn't see any supporting information for it. And I was somewhat demoralized because I thought, boy, if he really believes this stuff, he has, lost contact with, he's become detached from reality if he really believes this stuff. On the other hand, when I went into this and would, tell him how crazy some of these allegations were, there was never an indication of interest in what the actual facts were. In my opinion then, and my opinion now, is that the election was not stolen by fraud. And I haven't seen anything since the election that changes my mind on that, including the 2000 Mules movie.
Well, maybe you can assess that 2,000 mules, and people are talking about that.
Well, I mean, just in a nutshell, I just think the GBI was unimpressed with it, and I was similarly unimpressed with it because I think
What's the GBI?
Because I was holding my fire on that to see what the photographic evidence was, because I thought, well, hell, if they have a lot of photographs of the same person dumping a lot of ballots in different boxes, that's hard to explain. So I wanted to see what the photographic evidence was, but the cell phone data is singularly unimpressive. I mean, it basically, if you take 2 million cell phones and figure out where they are physically in a big city like Atlanta or wherever, just by definition, you're going to find many hundreds of them have passed by and spent time in the vicinity of these boxes. And the premise that, if you go by a box, 5 boxes or whatever it was, that's a mule is just indefensible. It by definition, you're going to have hundreds of this. I mean, I saw one contractor said, we figured out that our truck alone would account for 6 cell phone signals. This was some kind of contractor, and our route would take us by these things on a regular basis. So but then when the movie came out, I think the photographic evidence in it was completely I mean, there was a little bit of it, but it was lacking. It didn't establish widespread illegal harvesting. The other thing is people don't understand is that it's not clear that even if you can show harvesting, that changes the results of the election. The courts are not going to throw out votes and then figure out what votes were harvested and throw them out. It's still the burden on the challenging party to show that illegal votes were cast. Votes were the result of undue influence or bribes, or there was really, the person was non-compos mentis. But absent that evidence, I just didn't see courts throwing out votes anyway. I felt that before the election, it was possible to talk sense to the president. And while you sometimes had to engage in, a big wrestling match with him, that it was possible to keep things on track. But I felt that after the election, he didn't seem to be listening, and I didn't think it was, that I was inclined not to stay around if he wasn't listening to advice from me or his other cabinet secretaries.
So on December 14th, Barr quit. Now, the Attorney General wasn't the only person who told the president that his claims were false. Other officials and close advisors told him the same thing.
Rather than try to address a counterfactual or a hypothetical, let me just say there were instances where the president would say, people are telling me this, or I've heard this, or I saw on television, this impropriety in Atlanta or Pennsylvania or something. And we were in a position to say, how people have always looked at that, and we know that you're getting bad information. That's not correct. It's demonstrated to be incorrect from our point of view. It's been debunked.
or so after the election day. And at that meeting, various allegations of fraud were discussed. And, Eric and Pat didn't, told the group, the president included, that, none of those allegations had been substantiated to the point where they could be the basis for any litigation challenge to the election.
President Trump's own vice president and his top advisors also knew that there wasn't evidence to support the claims that the president was making.
Anyone else other than Mr. Meadows who asked you about the status outside of your legal group, Mr. Morgan and the others you mentioned, anyone else who asked you the status of what you were finding in your assessment of it?
Yes, sir.
Who's that?
Peter Navarro.
When did you talk to Mr. Navarro?
Mid-November.
Around the same time as Mr. Meadows?
Yes, sir.
And tell me about that conversation.
I recall him asking me questions about Dominion and maybe some other categories of allegations of voter fraud. And I remember telling him that I didn't believe the Dominion allegations because I thought the hand recount in Georgia would resolve any issues with the technology problem and with Dominion or Dominion flipping votes. And I mentioned at that time that the CISA, Chris Krebs, had recently released a report saying that the election was secure. And I believe Mr. Navarro accused me of being an agent of the deep state working with Chris Krebs against the president. And I never took another phone call from Mr. Navarro.
Anyone else besides Mr. Meadows, Mr. Navarro, Mr. Hertzman that you had discussions with inquiring about what you were finding in your review of the allegations that were pouring in?
I believe I had about a 15-second conversation with the vice president about it as well.
When was that?
During one of the visits to the White House. I don't know which one. I think it was the first one in November. I had met him briefly at the campaign, and he remembered me and saw me. And he asked what I was doing on the campaign, and I told him that, we were looking into some of the issues related to voter fraud. And he asked me, I don't remember his exact words, but he asked me if we were finding anything. And I said that I didn't believe we were finding it, or I was not personally finding anything sufficient to alter the results of the election. And he thanked me. That was our interaction.
At a later hearing, you'll hear live testimony from the former acting Deputy Attorney General of the Department of Justice, Rich Donahue. But now I'd like to play a portion of his testimony.
I tried to, again, put this in perspective and to try to put it in very clear terms to the president. And I said something to the effect of, sir, we've done dozens of investigations, hundreds of interviews. The major allegations are not supported by the evidence developed. We've looked at Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Nevada. We're doing our job. Much of the info you're getting is false. And then I went into, for instance, this thing from Michigan, this report about 68% error rate. Reality is it was only 0.0063% error rate, less than 1 in 15,000. So the president accepted that. He said, okay, fine, but what about the others? And again, this gets back to the point that there were so many of these allegations that when you gave him a very direct answer on one of them, he wouldn't fight us on it, but he would move to another allegation. So then I talked a little bit about the Pennsylvania truck driver. This is another allegation that had come up. And this claim was by a truck driver who believed, perhaps honestly, that he had transported an entire tractor-trailer truck full of ballots from New York to Pennsylvania. And this was, again, out there in the public and discussed. And I essentially said, look, we looked at that allegation. We looked at both ends, both the people who load the truck and the people who unload the truck. And that allegation was not supported by the evidence. Again, he said, okay. And then he said, no, I didn't mention that one. What about the others? And I said, okay, well, with regard to Georgia, we looked at the tape, we interviewed the witnesses. There is no suitcase. The president kept fixating on this suitcase that supposedly had fraudulent ballots, and that the suitcase was rolled out from under the table. And I said, no, sir, there is no suitcase. You can watch that video over and over. There is no suitcase. There is a wheeled bin where they carry the ballots, and that's just how they move ballots around that facility. There's nothing suspicious about that at all.
Yes, thank you.
I told them that there was no multiple scanning of the ballots. One part of that allegation was that they were taking one ballot and scanning it through 3 or 4 or 5 times to rack up votes, presumably for Vice President Biden. I told them that the video did not support that.
Thank you.
Then he went off on double voting. At the top of the next page, he said, dead people are voting. Indians are getting paid to vote.
Indians are getting paid to vote. That's a new one.
There's a lot of fraud going on here. Told him flat out that much of the information he's getting is false and or just not supported by the evidence. We look at the allegations, but they don't pan out.
Mr. Barr and his advisors were not the only ones who determined that the president's allegations regarding Dominion voting machines were false. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record of this hearing reports issued by the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA, that addressed and rejected the claims of manipulation of voting machines in the 2020 election.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also ask unanimous consent to include in the record a report prepared by the Michigan Senate Oversight Committee that disproved claims of election fraud in Michigan, as well as a statement by 59 of the country's leading election security scientists, noting the absence of any credible evidence that the 2020 election had been altered through technical compromise, and 5 other reports from organizations and individuals confirming there was no widespread fraud in the 2020 election or describing the spread of the former president's lies.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Pursuant to the order of the committee for today, the chair declares the committee in recess for a period of approximately 10 minutes.
Okay, so we can have lunch. Thank you for watching this hearing with me.
You're watching live coverage from the newsroom of the Washington Post of this second in a series of hearings this month.
I think next time I will maybe go with C-SPAN, because they're also having a live hearing on YouTube that I can dual screen with, and they seem to have subtitles on the screen as people are testifying. So that would be handy, because sometimes being able to process the written word as well as listen to the audio evidence can be more engaging, because you can process it from 2 different angles. So yes, what's the most interesting part of that? I was most gripped by Donahue's testimony when he was describing the president's response, as he said, we have investigated these claims, specifically this one, and this one was debunked. There was no evidence to support this claim. And Trump would say, okay, sure, but what about all these others? Because that is how propaganda works. You throw things against the wall. He wanted to find something that would stick. He also wanted to find people who would just make things up for him. If everybody remembers the call to Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, who taped that conversation that involved Trump saying, I just need you to find me 7,000, how many votes? 11,780 votes, because that was the discrepancy between his voting total and the total of votes for Biden. So that would have been giving one more vote, so that Trump then had a majority of one vote. So he's like, do the bare minimum for me. Bring into being these votes, find them for me. And I listened to the audio of that call. Not everybody did. I hope they bring in some more audio. I wish they brought in some more audio today of just that evidence of Trump's clear determination to manufacture an outcome favorable to his own desire to remain in office regardless of the results of the election. His own determination to find collaborators who would give him what he needed, manufacture voting outcomes, find him 11,780 more votes. So thanks for being with me live today, Christopher. It's been enjoyable. I'm going to go practice some singing and eat lunch and tidy things and perhaps return later, but I might also try to do some other things. So I might not return for the second half of the hearing today. We'll see. I do have some personal stuff to get to. I should be trying to make myself more employable by working through updating my credentials to be recognized in America, my Australian credentials. I have a master's degree. I could be doing a job, but I do also enjoy talking to people on the internet who are similarly minded in terms of learning enough about America and learning enough about the dynamics of how American voters work and the American public works to be able to more effectively respond to the challenges of our time. And they are considerable challenges. We live in an era of relative prosperity. The relative peace has gone down because Russia has escalated its system of attacking the West to not only attack American democracy, use propaganda to increase division and conflict in the United States and promote guns, but also, and thereby promote Americans killing themselves and each other at higher rates. But the Russian corrupt government has also attacked a Western ally, namely Ukraine, and is doing so in a way that's going to jeopardize food security for millions of people on the continent of Africa. So definitely living in a relatively peaceful time that becomes less true when you consider a future in which a Russian naval blockade of Ukrainian ports and Ukrainian wheat exports will potentially lead to the death of tens of millions of people. And look, I still have, I think, solid reasons for blaming Donald Trump for emboldening the Kremlin, emboldening Vladimir Putin and helping him in furtherance of his democracy sabotaging agenda. I believe that part of Vladimir Putin's motivation to undermine the West is to undermine the development of renewable energy technologies and thereby increase dependency on fossil fuels, to increase global dependency on Russian exports of oil and gas in order to personally, financially benefit Vladimir Putin and his allies. And yes, America certainly suffered from that when former President Trump was beholden to Vladimir Putin's efforts to manipulate people via social media into staying at home and failing to vote for Hillary Clinton. I believe that people around the world have suffered as a consequence of Russian meddling in the Brexit referendum in the UK. And now it's going to be very much more direct suffering with the looming food shortages, and therefore the looming suffering from children and families and adults, men, women, and children who will suffer as a consequence of the blockading of Ukrainian ports and Ukrainian wheat exports. Christopher says, just let them hear you talk. They will hire you immediately, I promise. That does sound lovely, Christopher. I still do have to be able to tick the box of meeting certain professional credentials, and but your support is so welcomed and so appreciated, because it is a strength of mine. I am good at the talking. I have certain areas of strength and confidence with speaking is one of them. And there's certainly a large requirement for the services of speech pathologists. That's my background. Speech pathology is a difficult phrase to articulate, but I can do it if I put my mind to it. And I certainly have a lot of sympathy and compassion for children and adults who experience some obstacle with their communication skills, and who may have articulation issues or language development issues or stuttering issues. And it's nice to be able to have a skill set and a professional qualification that allows me to help others. So there's been a strong concentration on the political side for me for a while, but I'm hoping to get back into some part-time work in that field. Christopher says, the same way you express yourself here, express yourself during any interview, no worries. Thank you so much. Have a great day. For anybody else who wants to continue to watch the live stream of the hearings, they're obviously still being broadcast through C-SPAN, Washington Post. I think a lot of the channels are doing it. And let's keep our ears to the ground, whether it be through listening to the live hearings or watching updates on Twitter. Whatever floats your boat, whatever's convenient for you all to do, I hope we do so today, because this is the noise we make. The political chatter we engage in, the level of interest we exhibit, has a degree of contagion through the world. There's a cumulative pile that's composed of everybody's chatter and all of our output and all of our utterances. And the bigger that pile of attention is, the more other people on the outskirts of that concentrated attention pile begin to be curious. What are these people talking about? What am I missing out on? I should engage for myself. So the more noise we make, the more attention we pay, the more we draw others in to engage with all of this voluminous evidence that Donald Trump was part of a seditious conspiracy to illegally, illegitimately retain power in the United States, to hold on to his position in office, regardless of the demonstrated will of a majority of American voters in a majority of American states. So not only did Trump lose the popular vote, he lost the Electoral College vote, thanks to every person who made the effort to see through his charlatan promises, his fascist-style populist pandering, particularly pandering to people with sexist grievances, people with racist grievances, people who felt themselves to be badly done by. And I'll very quickly bring up an article to share from Newsweek before their owners got taken over by more conservative people. Right. Okay. So I'm just going to bring this up on screen. This is like my parting gift, is sharing this story, which has some important evidence to basically help us better understand why we have to not allow nihilistic people to drag us down with them. So this is published in 2019, that rising death rates amongst white Americans is linked to perceived threat to their dominant social status. The study didn't really show that so much, but it did illustrate that it was an exception to the national trend of increasing longevity expectations. The white middle-aged people were showing a reversal of that trend. They were bucking the trend, and the researchers were speculating that that was linked to a loss of perceived status. That was linked to a psychological phenomenon of I'm not as special anymore, because the real social and economic outcomes weren't showing that white people were being discriminated against or losing out. But yes, the mortality rate for white people was rising in this particular specific population. It was a phenomenon that had been unfolding for 2 decades. It could not be explained by social or economic status disadvantage, and instead was driven by a perceived threat to status. The anxiety of whites is coming from a misperception that their dominant status in society is being threatened, which is manifesting in multiple forms of psychological and physiological stress. Mind-body linkage, people feel bad about something psychologically, it's influencing their actions and it's influencing their body response. So an increase in deaths of despair, which is deaths categorized as being relating to despair because it relates to alcohol consumption, opioid use, opioid overdose, suicides, and even rising chronic diseases such as hypertension and obesity. People not taking care of themselves and people taking unnecessary risks, such as consuming potentially deadly amounts of drugs. So that's all from me. I'll scroll up to that article headline again, so you can Google it for yourself if you want to read further, if it's of interest to you. Rising death rates amongst white Americans linked to perceived threat to their dominant social status. This is also why I believe that many white men are so attached to the idea that the Second Amendment means, they're convinced that they have to defend this meaning, that it means their rights shall not be infringed, their right to own whatever weaponry they want, as many weapons, as extravagantly deadly weapons as they can conceive of, as gun manufacturers can make, that is their right to own them and not have to submit to background checks or be subject to red flag laws or any waiting periods. They should be uninfringed in any way, because they need those weapons in their own hearts to defend against what they perceive to be an erosion of their social status as white men and an erosion of their ability to dominate and intimidate others. Thanks, Christopher. High five. Cyber high five. Take care. Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks to any replay viewers as well. Take care and have a great day. Bye.